3 years ago, I tried to jump in front of a train. I was commuting to London at the time, and the train that should have passed in front of me, London passed behind me. For whatever reason on that day, it changed tracks. I didn't see the light immediately. I just saw this as additional evidence that I couldn't do anything right. My own train turned up, I got on it, I went to work, and I had a breakdown. This pattern of behavior wasn't actually all that unusual for me. See, I haven't always been autistic. Before I was autistic, I was weird. I was the strange one, best avoided because of my unusual behaviors. I'd react in strange ways in seemingly normal situations. These situations would trigger what other people viewed as tantrums. I found situations where a lot of people were present particularly difficult, from giving talks to socializing down the pub, both of which, when you're a student, are hard to avoid. I managed to avoid giving the talks. Socializing, though, was particularly painful. I'd have to drink to gain the confidence to talk to people, but the bars would be loud, in those days smoky, and the lights would be bright. It would be so packed I couldn't avoid people touching me. There'd be jokes that I wouldn't get, or I'd take personally, not being able to read from someone's face whether they were joking or being insulting, but I'd always assume the worst. And then as postgrad, I started my PhD and had to add in doing all of this stuff, but at conferences, in new places which I'd have to fly to, which I hate, and where you have to talk to people because networking is what you do. It's how you become successful. So to cope a little better, I'd drink some more, and I'd wake up feeling paranoid, and knowing that I'd have to go through it again for the rest of the week. See, the problem is I have a limited capacity. My coping cup is quite small, and it would overflow, and the same triggers would become more and more painful, associating themselves with feelings of self-loathing, and a firm belief that the people with me hated me. The rooms would get louder, the lights would get brighter, smells would get stronger. It'd feel like the room and the people were closing in on me, and I'd crash. Sometimes I had a tantrum, and sometimes I ran away. Often I did both. I was always depressed and often suicidal. In addition to various locations in the UK, in 2000 I did this in Warsaw, in 2002 Berlin and Potsdam, and in 2003 I took my crazy tour to the Netherlands, Finland, and various cities in Germany. I couldn't understand what was happening. I'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but although the therapy helped, I couldn't find peace. I clearly had the depression, but the manic phases just didn't seem to fit. And then in 2018, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I felt liberated because I finally had an answer. I had that missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. But when you tell people you're autistic, you get a couple of common responses. You don't look autistic. How am I meant to look? I could understand if they said you don't behave like you're autistic, because that would mean that I'm fitting in with what is perceived to be normal, but they don't say that. See, the severity of my autism is not how you see it, it's how I experience it. If I don't look autistic, it's because I can mask really well. And masking's like a camouflage that you wear to appear normal. But faking it like this takes energy, and by the end of the day, I'm exhausted. That's when the mask falls off, and that's when I crash. I also get told we're all somewhere on the spectrum. We're not. We might all have traits commonly associated with autism. Might be shy, might like numbers, might be obsessed by certain subjects. But being obsessed by a field of research doesn't make you autistic. That makes you ambitious. Autism isn't diagnosed by ticking off a few of these traits from a checklist. Our brains are wired differently. They function in different ways. We respond in different ways to stimuli. For me, I'm particularly hypersensitive to sound, sight, and smell. So loud, bright, smelly places can easily become overwhelming for me. You can imagine I don't go to many nightclubs. But the hypersensitivity has a flip side. It's really useful in the lab. Being sensitive to very small changes is great when you're troubleshooting. I can hear small changes in the frequency of vacuum pumps, smell when something starts to overheat, or just notice when indicator lights change or go out. Neurodiversity, this different wiring of the brain to neurotypical people, is not all negative. Expecting all autistic people to be shy loners stigmatizes the condition, as well as making us think, well, maybe I'm not autistic. I'm actually very social, but I don't know how to start a conversation. In fact, later on, if you see me stood by myself looking lost, I'll be hoping that someone will come and talk to me. But when they do, I'll feel like a fraud, because it's not how I'm supposed to behave. We need to push against this stereotypical view of what it means to be autistic. And despite all the weaknesses associated with autism, and there are a lot of weaknesses, I really believe it's one of my biggest strengths. For me, there are a lot of positives. For example, my PhD was about space debris. I wanted to know how much debris there was in a particular orbit, and so to do this, I used a dust impact detector called DEBI. And DEBI orbited the Earth a couple hundred miles up in a polar orbit. So that meant it went from pole to pole as the Earth spun below it. And this way, it covers just about every point on Earth. Each time, a piece of debris the size of the dust that you can see hanging in the lights hit a piece of aluminium foil the size of a CD case at 30,000 miles an hour. The electronics would trigger, beam it back down to Earth, and then I would analyze the data. I wrote some software so I could work out if what hit the sensor was indeed space debris or something else, something like dust from the tail of a comet that passed by decades ago. I downloaded the data knowing from the predictions I'd have 1, maybe 2 impacts to analyze for that month. These were the impacts for that month. This was an overwhelming amount of data. And this is just 1 month. For the entire data set, I must have had approaching 1 million events. But then I started to look at the data, and I started to see patterns, because I really like patterns, and I really like playing with data. I started to see events that only happened when the spacecraft went from sunlight into darkness, and vice versa. Another set of data only bizarrely happened when we passed over a particular radar station. It's fair to say that DEBI was hypersensitive. But the data wasn't just overwhelming for me. I could see that it was coming in bursts. I'd get a few days of a lot of data, and then DEBI would crash and recover, reset, and start the process all over again. DEBI was wired differently, and DEBI had a lot of triggers. It takes one to know one. And looking through all the data, I was able to identify these triggers, and after a lot of processing, remove all this noise just to be left with the real impacts. You're going to have to trust me on this one or read my thesis. So I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 42, and that might seem relatively old, but when I was at school, there was nothing else I could be diagnosed with. Asperger's wasn't then a diagnosable condition in the UK. I was too so-called high-functioning to be diagnosed with autism. And that's going to be the case for many people in my generation. I was diagnosed because I felt different and asked for help, but many don't. You probably work with people who fit all the diagnostic criteria for autism, but like me, they're just the weird one. And even if you do seek a diagnosis, the waiting list can be so long that you're left in limbo, knowing that you need adjustments to be made, but not having the piece of paper that you need as evidence. And even if you regard autism as a label, a diagnosis, an identity, you might not want to know because of the stigma that the word autism has. But that's no reason not to provide support. If we only support people with a diagnosis in autism, we're missing out a chunk of the population who, for whatever reason, don't have that diagnosis. We need to help those people seek a diagnosis so that those who've fallen under the radar or who are afraid of the stigma still have a hope of a normal life. And this is important because autistic people have a higher suicide rate than the general population. These statistics of people diagnosed with Asperger's. 66% had suicidal thoughts. 1 in 3 planned or attempted suicide. Most of my suicidal thoughts came before diagnosis, but autism isn't a mental illness, and autism doesn't cause depression. Failure to cope in a neurotypical world causes depression. Being bullied or mocked or made to feel lonely makes you suicidal. Only 16% of autistic adults are in full-time employment, yet the stats show that over 3/4 of those who are unemployed want to work. Why is there this disparity? It's time to look at the individual beyond the stereotype. If you employ someone who's autistic, rather than send them to occupational health to see how they say we should treat someone on the spectrum, ask the individual what adjustments they require. Autistic people can be honest, hardworking, determined, kind-hearted, with an amazing attention to detail. We can process information in ways in which neurotypical people can't imagine doing. Our brains and our characters, our traits, they don't need fixing or changing. But most importantly, we're all different. There's as much diversity amongst the neurodiverse as there is amongst the neurotypical. I'm fortunate that I work in a group that sees the values of values my condition above the detriments. And this started at the interview when I was able to have a few minutes beforehand to let my mind calm down. There were no handshakes in the interview, and I was able to sit in an area of the room that had no distractions. And these might seem like really minor adjustments, but they had a significant impact. I got the job. I was able to then work in an area of the office with no fluorescent lighting, and again, no visual distractions. If there's a problem, we can have a conversation and make further adjustments. I feel accepted, and I don't have to wear the mask. As a result, I'm at my most productive, but I realise that this isn't going to be the case for everyone. I'm lucky. What worked for me doesn't work for everyone else, and you have to have the conversation. My brain has made me what I am today, and there's nothing about it I would change. I failed to cope with the world, but the world fails to cope with me. For the neurotypical people in the audience, imagine a world in which we, the neurodiverse, were the majority. So imagine a neurodiverse world. How would you feel not being able to be spontaneous in a world that desires predictability? So where I work, a group of us have recently started up a neurodiverse staff network. It's a safe space for people with autism, Asperger's, ADHD, or other neurodiverse conditions. If you think you might be on the spectrum, you're also welcome. If any member of our staff wants to learn how to be more inclusive, they can come along and talk to us. We're going to be starting conversation with groups such as HR, estates, IT, in order to help each other. Autistic employees can add so much to your organisation. If someone's brave enough to disclose their autism to you, don't question their diagnosis. Ask what you can do to help and start a conversation. Thank you.